New data has once again come out implicating BlameF as the biggest eco hunter in Tier 1 CS, at least in relation to his entries on full buy rounds. The data also suggests a couple of other things, that Ime might be the best anti-eco player in terms of efficiency in Tier 1 CS, and Snax is probably the worst. Now, one of the things about BlameF is I've done this data before. Usually I focus more on like full ecos, whereas this data is against buys under 3,300 per player, which means it's including force buys and including half buys, which I actually think isn't necessarily what I'd call an anti-eco. If your opponents have like full Galils or they have, you know, a bunch of MP9s and an M4 or two, I don't really think that counts to me as much as something where you're playing against all pistols. And I think those are drastically different because force buys and half buys are extremely dangerous. I mean, NIP just lost to a 5 USB save. It's important to have players that can actually get those kills on those rounds. Now, as I've said before, one of the reasons, or the main reason really, that BlameF is seen as so egregious of an eco hunter isn't because he goes generally for the most in terms of actual number of opening kills overall against pistols. It's the ratio. Because if you play hyper aggressive against pistols, but super passive against full buys, then you're just gonna look like a massive eco hunter, as opposed to someone like Donk or Xerxin, who play fairly similar, but on full buys they're playing very aggressive to begin with, right? So it doesn't look like a huge detachment from their normal gameplay style. Now, I watched this game, and this is from a very recent event. This is a couple of days ago, where you're seeing fnatic versus 9Z, and BlameF ends this game something like 21-9 over 24 rounds. So he's like barely dying at all. And I wanted to take a look at what it actually looks like for him when he plays against a full buy or he plays against ecos. And some of the plays in this game are a little crazy. So here, his team is going for this play out long, and he's actually going to end up lurking. Of course, generally you're going to see lurkers probably activate a little bit more against pistols than they do against rifles, because it just kind of makes sense for that to be the case, right? You can be a bit more aggressive and find openings when you're playing against pistols, or you can take some map control and see if they're stacking or things like that. Usually you wouldn't see a Mac 10 being the kind of passive lurker in a situation like this, but if you think about it really, Dust 2 is the map where the Mac 10 is probably the least effective. I mean, what are you going to do? Maybe you do like a B rush if you have a Mac 10, but long is obviously very long range, and short also. I mean, if they're not close short, like in this angle here, you're also very long range, right? There's not an obvious place to bring a Mac 10, so keeping them sitting in towards middle is probably a good idea. And honestly, I think there's a lot you can learn from BlameF in terms of playing smart and taking advantageous engagements, but sometimes it does feel like he pushes it to the limit of reasonability. So one of the arguments that was talked about was like, you know, these rounds aren't easy to win, and so it's important to have players, especially if you're on a weaker team, it's important to have players that can actually activate and get you kills in these situations, so the KD really makes a big difference. However, one of the things about BlameF is his kill death versus ecos is actually not all that high. If you compare him to the players around him that get similar amounts of opening kills, opening deaths on anti-ecos, usually their KD is up above 3. And I'm talking, this is from my data specifically, so this is mostly against actual ecos. Usually their KD is above 3, whereas BlameF is in like the 2.5 range, and Ime is in the 4.5 range, which is why I'm kind of rating him as possibly the best anti-eco player overall. You can see what he did here. I mean, he hurt a scout mid, he essentially rushed lower extremely aggressively. He only had a FAMAS, so if he dies with it, it's not the end of the world, but you don't want someone picking it up. I think he had someone spotting middle, so I think he knew there wasn't anybody coming lower, so he had all the ability in the world to go for that type of play, and I think that's just a smart play. And the thing is, you're gonna notice that BlameF doesn't go for mostly anything ridiculous on anti-ecos. He's just looking for space, he's looking to take control, and to some extent you have to keep in mind that a play you make against rifles that is a standard play that might not end up being a kill or death, like this one at long, for example, doesn't end up being an opening kill or death, so it doesn't end up being an opening kill attempt. But if your opponents have pistols, well, if they are long, there's a decent chance they swing on you and you end up into a gunfight, and one of you gets a kill or dies, right? It's quite a bit different the way your opponents are playing. So if you go for these kind of soft entries that BlameF has been going for a lot on Fnatic, where he's looking for something, if they're going to give him a kill, he'll take it. If they're not, then he's not going to force it too aggressively. I think that's the exact type of play that will get you a lot more opening kill attempts than expected against ecos, right? Especially the one in mid that we saw a little bit earlier. He might not go for that against an op, but if that's a rifle, maybe he peeks that and they, you know, they trade some damage and they back up, right? As opposed to a scout taking a bit of a risk there, being in the middle of the open, accepting that he might get caught, but that he can also potentially get himself a kill, right? This is another play that you would likely see him make an engagement here against pistols, right? He just walks out mid, you know, he's probably going to see someone. But if I'm going to be honest, listen, this is just my opinion here, but this lurk, to me, this should get you sent right to jail. This lurk, they've got 12 seconds. This lurk, I feel like this lurk should get you sent straight to jail. This lurk straight to jail. Okay, they're 2v5. Okay. They're coming up cat 5v5. BlameF he didn't do anything crazy. He walked out mid, threw a little bit of fake. He smoked off CT, mollied behind it. That's great play. And it's not like he's not playing stupidly passive. But then his team going for this lurk, they end up losing a couple of players. Now they're 2v3, I guess, on the A bomb site. 2 people running up cat, 20 seconds. BlameF commits through B. I think the idea is BlameF might be thinking that he could, if this cat hold doesn't work, right, he's probably thinking he's gonna save if the cat push doesn't work. And if it does work, then he can flank the CT spawn play. But I mean, it's they don't have long control, so they could be getting shot at from long. Now they don't have cat control because BlameF left the flank, and they don't yet have CT spawn control, but this will actually end up working because Crims just absolutely destroys everyone running up cat. So, I mean, I guess it works, but that's the type of play people see BlameF make, and they're like, wow. And then they see him do something aggressive, like he's probably gonna do. I'm just gonna guess he's probably gonna do it in this round. Something a little aggressive, make an open and kill attempt. No, actually he didn't. This is what I was talking about though, by the way, where like, you know, you're looking for contact in a way that the pistols are willing to take those duels because they're on pistols. They're willing to fight there that they might not be doing with rifles. You know, you see him go for something like that, and then against pistols, he goes for something more aggressive, and you're thinking, okay. But if you actually look at the way this is actually played, I mean, what does he do here? He does exactly what he did last round. Now, he's not going to end up getting an open and kill attempt, and he does this, look, he sticks around a little bit more, but I don't think anything BlameF does on anti-ecos is weird almost at all. I don't think he hunts kills unreasonably. I think he takes engagements that make a lot of sense. He's a little bit more aggressive, looking for players to make mistakes, and especially, I mean, look, the way he peeked into CT here, you don't want to do this against the buy because they could be opping CT. They've got much better rifles. They can win duels against you. But if you know your opponents are on pistols, this is a completely reasonable play to make. He didn't overpeak it even. He like just cleared out CT, which is engagements that you're probably happy to make when you're fighting against people with a bad buy. And so this differentiation in the way he's playing makes perfect sense. However, some of the way he plays on full gun rounds feels a little bit odd at times. Now, keep in mind, of course, he's playing on a team, right? It's part of his system. If his teammates didn't like what he was doing, he probably wouldn't play the same way, right? He could play a bit differently, but it works. And generally, I mean, different kills have differing amounts of impact, of course. However, still, at the end of the day, if you can be a player that gets kills and gets them consistently and like guarantees that they're going to get openings or just kills in general, then you're being a pretty positive impact on your team, even if you're playing overtly passive. And it's not like BlameF is scared to go for entries, right? When he's got one of the spawns to go for an entry, he's going for it. They're not playing around completely differently. And even in the mid round, when he's part of the pack and he's going with his team, he's a little slower maybe than some players, but this isn't something I don't think you'd see all that different out of a lot of kind of players, but like, you know, like star players in the second, third in role, right? He's playing mostly in the same vein as that. And this is a play you want here. That's a smart play that he just made there, right? Like, if nobody flashes and peeks, then it just kind of looks like baiting. But at the same time, if the play comes that you're expecting, he's dodging the flash, watching the flank at the same time, his whole team gets blind, and he spins back around and gets the kill. You know, like, that's just a positive play that has a positive impact on the game. And then when he makes his way up long, by the way, this is a play I kind of enjoy, especially if you have the smoke. If you have a smoke CT and you have a smoke cross, and then you molly in between, it's very very effective to come through the smoke times. Sometimes it's pretty risky to do it the way BlameF did there, but if you do it kind of a low percent of the time and you know a player is kind of trapped in the middle there, plus with the flash, it's actually just a pretty effective play, right? And that is a ridiculous spray down. Love or hate BlameF's playstyle, the guy gets frags, and the thing is, when he's in positions where he's playing more aggressive and he's part of the pack and he's going with his team, he makes some really heads-up plays as well and some out plays where he can get aggressive and do an insanely good job. I do agree, though, with some people will say that he plays too passive, and I think I'm leaning towards agreeing with that, but I think if you were to copy his playstyle specifically on anti-ecos, I don't think he does anything necessarily wrong. Now, the reason I said Ime might be the best anti-eco player in tier 1 is because based on Nero's data, he's got the highest ADR, at least as far as I can find, maybe someone slightly higher, as a ratio like on ecos compared to full buys. So he gets 120 ADR versus buys 3,300 and under, and 82 versus full buys, right? So he gets a drastically higher amount against anti-ecos. And the reason I say he's the best is because he doesn't get he's got the exact same number of open and kill attempts on full buys as versus 3,300 and less buys, which suggests at least that he probably plays very, very similar to how he plays on full buys compared to anti-ecos, so he doesn't seem to adjust his playstyle much at all. When I look at my data, where again I was looking at lighter buys, I think under 1,900 per player, I think was the buy I was looking at, he's got one of the highest KDs against ecos. He's got nearly a 5 KDA, whereas someone like BlameF is at 2.8, Apex is at 3.3, Hunter's at 2.5, Naf's at 2.9, Brokey's at 2.3, right? Like most players are between like 2 to 3.5, and some oppers, typically like the more passive oppers, like Shiro I think is at 6 or something, right? Players that don't really take any risks, but Ime seems to play exactly the same as he does against full buy rounds, but gets drastically more ADR and just does not die. And so I think that's basically exactly the type of player you kind of want on an anti-eco, right? I mean, BlameF gets higher ADR. BlameF gets 130, I believe, to Ime's 120. But BlameF obviously plays more aggressively on those rounds. Now, maybe you could say that BlameF on anti-ecos, and I mean, I kind of made this argument myself, is like the perfect player. And so he actually is better. But his KD is slightly less. And the drastic difference means there's definitely a change between, you know, those types of rounds. But again, this round he gets an opening kill, he clears lower, and I'll show you next round, right? Because he clears lower in a very similar way against full buys. Now, maybe you want someone to play slightly slower against ecos. That's probably not a bad idea, but it really depends on the scenarios you're in and the situations, you know, what control you know you have. And I think when I looked at old school Astralis, they would actually make a lot of plays on, and by old school I mean like 2018, 2019, you know, prime Astralis, they would make a lot of plays on anti-ecos that your traditional values for anti-eco plays would suggest might not be the best play of all time. Like things like taking ladder on train, which is a fairly close range angle. A lot of players would say that you just shouldn't do that because it's a close range engagement. You're taking a lot of risk. And I think when it comes to pugs, I think that's generally going to be a pretty good rule to live by because your opponents are just going to give you free kills at longer range angles anyways. But to some extent, you do have to take some risks against pistols anyways, because no matter what, you're never going to have a 100% win rate against pistols, right? There's ways they're going to win. They're going to find angles. They're going to find stacks. And if you don't take control of certain areas because you know it's close range, maybe you can dial it back and take that control a little bit less often, but your opponents are going to eventually start to exploit you if you don't have some frequency of doing these types of plays, even against ecos. And I mean, when you're looking at Ime on gun rounds, this does look pretty much quite similar to exactly what it looked like when he was playing against pistols. And I'll show you another couple of rounds to demonstrate that I mean, it does feel like he doesn't really adjust his playstyle. So when looking at my data, which is rounds under 1900, Ime got the highest kills per round of any player against ecos. But that's not a bad thing unless you're really hunting them. And there are players like, I mean, BlameF, of course, but like Snappy, Apex, a lot of IGLs, honestly, they do feel like they see it's an anti-eco and they start pushing and going for kill after kill after kill and trying to hunt them down. And that really doesn't generally seem to be the case for Ime. I mean, when he sees it's an anti-eco, he appears to play pretty much exactly the same as he does against full buy rounds. Now, the question I want to ask is, what does Snax look like? Because Snax, the reason I have Snax so low on this list is specifically because Snax goes for a lot more open and kill attempts against ecos than he does against full buys. It's about a 1.5 ratio or almost a 1.5 ratio. So he seems to set himself up to go for more kills when he knows they're saving, or at least when they're on, you know, force fire or something like that. But he actually doesn't get any higher ADR. So in their very recent game against Heroic, G2 start out down 10-2, and this is kind of a really bad loss for G2, but they do actually begin a comeback by winning pistol round on the second half. And I want to compare some of these, you know, anti-ecos or anti-force buys they're going to be on, and it's a force buy they're playing against here, and look at Snax's playstyle in those compared to what he'll be doing in the gun rounds. Because there's a lot of, and by the way, this is a pretty interesting molly. This is actually going to land on the box just outside of B tons. The bounce is kind of insane to actually land there. If this is the type of situation he's in, and sometimes he dies, but his team is consistently right there behind him and he's just getting traded every single time, I have no problem if his opening kill attempt goes up and they just play more as a pack. And I think that actually may be the case, that they play more as a pack in these types of situations, and Snax is going out first when they're in these pack scenarios. Whereas, I mean, instead of Malbs going out, you have Snax going out. I think that's really smart, right? Because you'll often see Malbs will be first out. Sometimes Nico's first out on certain hits on gun rounds, and you probably don't really want that against pistols. You want those guys coming in second, third, right? The question is, was he hunting at the end there when he was going towards T-spawn? I can see an argument for it, but I think generally, if he just got himself to a position like this, what he's doing is he's setting up so his teammates can comfortably exit through tunnels and come to T-spawn. Although there is every reason that maybe they could have, and maybe they should have, just stayed in B site like this with the majority of their players and just covered tunnels. So I could see an argument either direction as to what he should have been doing there, because he did actually end up giving a Galil to Heroic for the third round. I'm not a huge fan of this type of play though, where you kind of just like set up and you do like an exec, but you're kind of like, I think in some scenarios, some bomb sites, it's fine, but I think when you play too different against ecos, I actually think it's part of a problem as well. I discussed that earlier with the surprising somewhat way that sometimes, you know, Prime Astralis would be playing. But here, I mean, I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with what he did here, but at the same time, this is a continuation of the fact that this is his Galil that's been picked up and lower, right? And there are 5 players in tunnels. Like, I don't like this part. When you looked at the way Na'Vi did this, they had a guy like checking. Sometimes they even molly bottom middle, but they had a guy checking and they would have calmed if there was a player in lower. They didn't go there with the whole team, and they still cleared lower just fine, right? Do you need... this is one thing I'm not a huge fan of. Like the 5 in one direction thing the entire round. I think regrouping into a 5-man hit after you've kind of probed the map a little bit seems to make a little bit more sense. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that these teams are practicing constantly, like day after day. And I think a lot of the time when you see teams that go for plays like that, and I know this from personal experience, like I've been on teams where we've had to call anti-eco strats that suck, because when we don't do that, we just continually lose when we like split on the map. Like people just get entry, they lose guns, opponents pick them up, and then they rotate around, and it just ends up going even more poorly. So although I'm really not a fan of the way that G2 plays their anti-ecos, I think it's more likely that that's a symptom of like struggling to solve problems on playing quote unquote normal anti-ecos than it is that Snax just loves these plays, right? I don't think there's so far anything I've seen that's like necessarily all that bad that he's doing, because when you think about it, when you see like Elige has talked about this, a lot of players talk about this, that there's entering and there's space taking or space creating. Entering is when you run into a bomb site first and the first player is unlikely to take an advantageous engagement. First player is likely to die. That's entering. You won't see Nico do that all that often, but sometimes you will, depending on the setup, right? Now, space creating is what star players like doing, and that's so you want something like a Liege, you want like a Twist, you want a Nico, you want them doing that type of play. As I say this, you know, Nico is, I mean, he's not really truly entering there, but because Snax is kind of more the entry, the upper angle is the more likely angle to kind of go terribly. The lower angle is trying to catch your opponents off guard, but whatever. Space taking is something you really want your star players doing, and that's taking control of positions early on in rounds. Usually you have sufficient utility, you've set up like a protocol, you're trying to get them into positions where they could take a good gunfight, and you want someone like Nico doing that. Right now, against pistols though, you probably might not want someone like Nico doing that quite as often. You might want to send someone like Snax in there first, because Snax is less likely to get the trade if Nico's to die first, and if you send two players together, then you send Snax first, Nico trades, and Nico can almost guaranteed that was kind of fucking crazy from Shush, by the way. And Nico can almost guaranteed prevent that gun from being retrieved. So I can definitely see the logic behind some of the plays where against pistols, Snax, he's not rushing. It's not like he sees they're on pistols and just gets hyper aggressive, but it does seem to be that he sees they're on pistols and he ends up being the guy leading out, right? But still, you're playing against pistols. Even regardless of that, you should still be getting more than 64. I think his ADR, I think he has 64, 65 ADR against full buys, and then like 64.6 against ecos. Like, I feel like in general, you should probably be getting more than that when you're fighting against, you know, half buys and ecos. But actually, as it turns out, the last round of this game is also against basically a force, or a kind of a half buy here from Heroic. This should fall under the 3,300 range, because 1,500, right? Maybe some utility. This is going to fall under the 3,300 range, and this is a round that Heroic manages to win. So I'm interested to see exactly what happens on this round. Initial from Snax to help his team get control. He's probably, I think, going to end up leading up. Okay. Well, I mean, in his defense, Shush just absolutely fucking destroys everybody here. I don't know if you can really blame Snax all that much for that. Oh my god. The only thing is, was he, like, should he have just pulled out his gun? Okay, so Flash, team gets blind. Pull out your gun! Pull out your gun! He should have pulled out his gun. He tried to jiggle it or whatever, but with Nico blind there, he probably just has to pull out his gun, and they probably win this round. But is Snax the worst? I mean, I haven't watched everybody, right? But Snax does appear to be one of the weaker players in terms of fragging against ecos. And I think the way he changes up his playstyle is very much justifiable, and I think it makes a lot of sense, but he also just needs to be getting kills more often, I think. Anyways, this went down a whole ass path. The title, I think, is still gonna be BlameF is not beating the allegations. But you know who else isn't beating the allegations is Snax. But who is beating the allegations, I think, is Ime, because people talk about him as this huge eco-fragger, but I don't think he does anything wrong, you know, personally.